Happy Days Are Here Forever is a work of alternate history fiction set during the Cold War. The following events are based on the Cold War Iron Curtain, a world-divided mod for Hearts of Iron 4. 1949. Red Chinese Victory. The situation of the world is precarious in 1949. Intelligence updates on the communist uprisings taking place in China and Greece fill President Truman's desk every morning. The most distressing came on the morning of June 6 of 1949, when Mao's forces stormed and captured the major city of Shanghai, a serious defeat for the nationalist government. In response, President Truman must choose between three options on how to handle the growing Red Menace. Direct intervention in the war would likely be the most successful option, but would be extremely costly in terms of men, equipment, and the ever-important poll numbers. On the other hand, leaving it to fate would almost guarantee a communist victory in China, a major national security risk and a huge blow to the president's popularity. In the end, President Truman decided to bring the issue to the United Nations, hoping that international military intervention and humanitarian aid would be the push the Republic needed to counter the PLA's increasing strength. Interestingly, the Soviet delegation chose to abstain on the measure for Chinese police action, rather than vote against it or outright veto it. Despite international intervention, it was becoming clear that communist forces would likely succeed in China. By October, nearly all of central China was under PLA rule, while the KMT desperately tried to hold the south. On November 20th, the nationalist capital of Guangzhou fell to communist forces, crushing all hopes for a sudden KMT comeback. Nationalist forces fled to the island of Formosa and into Burma, hoping to somehow organize a strong enough counterattack that would see the Republican flag fly over mainland China once more. Meanwhile, on the home front, Supreme Court Justices Frank Murphy and Wiley Rutledge died mere months from each other. As part of his presidential duty, Harry S. Truman must choose the next Supreme Court justices to fill the vacant seats. In a controversial move, President Truman appointed 2 liberal justices to the court, which would later vote to overturn the convictions of the Hollywood 10, under the argument that the 1-year prison sentence for the Hollywood 10 was not only excessive but downright unconstitutional. The move was applauded by many liberals and progressives, but heavily condemned by conservatives and the House Un-American Activities Committee. 1950. Madman MacArthur. On April 3, 1950, the PLA and the Republic of China signed an armistice after the former successfully captured the island of Hainan. The Republic's government was moved to Formosa, or Taiwan, which quickly found itself under American protection and economic support. With American help, the island was quickly fortified in the anticipation of a communist invasion. Shortly afterwards, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, launched a surprise invasion against the Republic of Korea to the south. DPRK forces stormed across the South Korean front as if it were made of glass, quickly capturing the Republic's capital of Seoul. The United States immediately called for international condemnation of the invasion and sent thousands of men and weapons to the Republic to stave off the communist forces. By July of 1950, the Republic had pushed the DPRK's forces back across the border, and by August they were fast approaching Pyongyang. The city fell on August 13th. 2 days later, the Kuomintang remnants in Taiwan offered to assist in the war effort. President Truman welcomed all the help he could get, never once considering how the newly proclaimed PRC would react. Reality set in on the 19th as PLA forces crossed the Yalu River and invaded Korea. By November, Pyongyang was back under communist control and the front lines looked nearly identical to what they were when the war began. Searching for a scapegoat, venerated World War II General Douglass MacArthur was blamed by Truman for the Chinese intervention in Korea. In response, General MacArthur proposed an arguably insane plan that involved using nuclear weapons in Chinese Manchuria in order to force their withdrawal from the war. President Truman was infuriated with MacArthur's continued disobedience and demanded that the general respect the chain of command and fall in place. The divide between the president and his military commanders was seemingly becoming wider by the day. Just across the sea, a welcome distraction came to steal the spotlight away from the growing mess that was Korea, the Treaty of San Francisco. With a formal peace signed and Japan's ability to wage war effectively neutered, the Allied occupation of Japan came to an end on January 12th of 1951. Unfortunately, the war situation's continued deterioration would soon shift focus back towards Korea by month's end. MacArthur's continued disobedience of White House war policy came to a head when President Truman requested a meeting with his senior military advisors on how to deal with General MacArthur. In the meeting, the Joint Chiefs conceded that MacArthur's dismissal would be for the best, but advised against said dismissal being for insubordination, as MacArthur would have the ability to appeal it through a court-martial. Infuriated by the general's continued disobedience and interpreting the advice of the Joint Chiefs as their attempts to watch out for a fellow military man, President Truman relieved MacArthur for insubordination, causing immense backlash. Exactly as the Joint Chiefs had predicted, MacArthur reacted with absolute fury and all but demanded a court-martial. An unnamed army private told the media he could hear MacArthur shout, "Glass-eyed son of a bitch didn't have the balls to say it to my face. Pinko-loving bastard wouldn't know strategy if it shot him in the nuts." 1951, Trumans Folly. The news of President Truman's dismissal of one of America's most beloved World War II heroes was met with near-universal condemnation. The president's popularity would continue to plummet as MacArthur returned to the US and gave a speech to Congress about his time as a general in both World War II and Korea. It seemed almost as if all the love and support the American people had for Harry Truman was now entirely refocused onto Douglas MacArthur. Sensing an opportunity to strike, Senate Republicans began inquiries into possibly impeaching President Truman, arguing that the decision to dismiss MacArthur was emotionally motivated and proved how unfit Truman was to be president. In the meantime, the court-martial of Douglas MacArthur went entirely in the general's favor, and he was found not guilty of insubordination in any of the actions taken in Korea. Shortly afterward, Republicans voted to move ahead with articles of impeachment after hearing testimony from both MacArthur and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. On April 15th of 1951, at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Harry S. Truman became the second president of the United States to be impeached in history. Before the Senate could decide his fate, however, Harry Truman became the first president in the history of the United States to resign from office, effective at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on April 19, 1951. In his farewell radio address, former President Truman insisted his decision to resign was not an admission of guilt, rather a sacrifice for the greater good and unity of the United States of America. Vice President Alben W. Barkley would take the oath of office later that day and become President of the United States until the elections of 1952. In his first act as president, Alben Barkley called for negotiations for a ceasefire in Korea. The front had changed only by mere inches since November of 1950, and there was no clear sign of victory for either side. Negotiations stalled when the question of Korean POWs was brought up. However, the North Koreans and Chinese eventually dropped this demand, as it was becoming increasingly clear that peace must be restored and reconstruction commence as soon as possible. The Korean War came to an end through armistice at midday, May 8th of 1951. With the whole ordeal over, Douglas MacArthur was now one of, if not the most popular man in the United States. He began to give speeches on his grand vision for America and her place in the world, as well as the threat of communism globally. Many on the American right urged him to seek the nomination of the Republican Party for president, which he was initially apprehensive about until officially announcing his intention to run on August 23rd. In response, the Democrats were desperately scrambling to find a candidate who had even an inkling of a chance to defeat MacArthur in a general election. Their answer came in the form of Dwight David Eisenhower, another World War II hero of equal fame and accomplishment, who served as Supreme Allied Commander and oversaw the D-Day landings in Europe. Some in the party feared that Eisenhower would not toe the party line, or that he was much too conservative to be the Democratic nominee, but even senior leaders of the party recognized that there was no feasible way to win the election with anyone else. With senior party leadership behind him, Dwight D. Eisenhower became the Democratic presidential nominee for the 1952 elections. Across the country, many wondered what these two old soldiers would have to say to each other come the debates.